My name is Nabila Farah, and I formerly lead the Global Health theme in Hughes Hall. First of all, let me welcome you all to Hughes Hall, and particularly to this meeting under the auspices of the Bridge, and jointly with the component of the Bridge known as the Global Health theme. The Bridge is an initiative that Hughes Hall has started, which aims to bring together academics in their work with practitioners in the real world, and to enable translation of their research into practice and also policy development. This meeting is part of a series of meetings that we're holding on the impact of the pandemic. It happens to be the COVID-19 pandemic, but it could be any pandemic, on our society, on our thinking and our practice going forward in some key sectors. The first meeting looked at the impact on medical education. The second meeting looked at, last week, looked at the impact on infrastructure, new work practices, how we might have to rethink our city design and our modes of transport, and what this might mean in terms of rebalancing population between countryside and urban areas, and the implications of that for rural policy and infrastructure. The meeting today is going to be focused primarily on legal, ethical and governance questions that have been brought into focus as a result of the pandemic, and has forced us to think about these areas in perhaps a different light. This evening, the meeting will be chaired by Dr. Markus Gehring, who's a fellow at Hughes Hall and a member of the Faculty of Law. Markus is also a fellow at the Lauterpacht Center for International Law, and his interests focus on European law and sustainable development, on European external relations law and policy, international trade, investment and finance policy, and European environmental law. So I'll hand over to Markus to introduce the participants for his session and to take the meeting forward. Over to you, Markus.
Thank you very much, Professor Farah. Thank you, Nabil. Yes, so this is a really timely discussion, because I think while looking at the medical and the science aspect of the COVID pandemic, we sometimes tend to forget that other social sciences are also involved in the study of COVID. And what we want to present today is not already polished research. We are going to present just a couple of ideas along the lines of our own specialties about the pandemic. So we are going to focus on 4 sub-themes. We're starting with Dr. John Barker, and I will introduce the speakers in turn, with aspects of international law and governance, responsibility questions, the role of science in international law. We're then moving on to sustainable development, the Sustainable Development Goals, post-pandemic recovery, what does environmental and climate law have to say? We're then focusing with, so the presenter for that is Chantalle Byron, a PhD researcher. We then move on to Dr. Lars Vinx, who's going to introduce the discussion about broader democratic and philosophical issues given rise to the discussions about the pandemic and the influence that such a crisis has on political systems. And we end the discussion with probably the hottest topic. We have Dr. Fotis Vergis and Dr. Martin Steinfeld on the question of the human rights impact, which I think we sometimes underestimate. We have huge majorities in parliament for locking down an entire country, and the human rights impact that those legal rules actually can have, I think is given very little attention. So I hope this is going to be an interesting discussion for all of you. And we're going to, after short introductions to the topic, we're going to go into breakout rooms, and then we're going to come together for a discussion. So our first speaker this evening is Dr. John Barker. He's a Life Fellow at Hughes Hall and was previously the chairman of the Foreign Compensation Commission in the UK Foreign Development and Commonwealth Office. He has over 30 years of experience working with governments, international development agencies, and non-governmental organizations, and is an expert in international governance, having spearheaded the Governance Lab initiative at the University of Cambridge. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Markus, and welcome everybody. I'm going to talk about two things: gain-of-function research and the World Health Organization. We know that the COVID-19 epidemic has caught many nations off guard, even though such pandemic was entirely predictable, and in fact was predicted. We also know that there have been politically motivated efforts to undermine a multilateral response during the pandemic, as well as to ignore the science. Both of these dynamics have been counterproductive, particularly when a coordinated and informed global response is most needed. All of this points to a dangerous disconnect between decision makers who have more power than knowledge and those who have more knowledge than power. This really is the story of the WHO, but on a larger scale, it's also the story of international efforts to combat global crises. That disconnect arises in part from perverse incentives and structural problems within states, which place political incentives at odds with the public interest, including countries that claim to be democracies. This plays out internally on the domestic plane and externally on the international plane. I would submit that it is a helpful model and a tool conceptual tool to understand this dysfunction, to see state sovereignty as a form of monopoly on power or gatekeeping on a single plane that produces mischief in both directions, both within the state domestically and beyond globally or on the international plane. This week in the US, we're seeing the distinction between political emphasis on optics over substance in rather stark form. And this is not a digression, because the WHO itself has had funding withdrawn in the middle of a serious pandemic, while the science and lessons learned have been ignored. In the UK, we've seen poor performance in managing the pandemic and a crisis of confidence evidenced by the creation of an alternative advisory group to SAGE. It's helpful also to bear in mind that there's two distinct risks. The first is the originating pathogen, and the second is human society's pathological responses. So looking through the lens of international law brings into focus, of course, the legal and institutional framework for pandemic prevention and responses. And it's notable that there are binding duties to report and apply international health regulations on the part of WHO, but their inspection and enforcement powers are very weak, with many functions under the thumb of state sovereignty. Equally significant is a donor-dependent funding structure, which means that its agenda is dictated by individual donors instead of its declared mandate. And it acts more like a puppet on a string, or more accurately, several strings. Another set of international questions relates to the management of additional risks introduced by ultra-hazardous activities, such as certain kinds of gain-of-function research. This phrase is a euphemism for making already harmful pathogens even more dangerous in the interests of scientific inquiry. Whether or not the present coronavirus came from an animal or from a laboratory accident, gain-of-function research has been and remains an accident waiting to happen. This cluster of issues raises the following question. Who has the authority, capacity, and legitimacy to assess, accept, and manage such risks on behalf of mankind? Clearly, no single institution, including the UN, can really claim to have all of these attributes, particularly capacity. And certainly no state where these activities take place could claim the right to expose other populations, let alone its own, to unacceptable levels of risk. So I'll just sort of note to sort of round up that in the international health space, like the international community, is highly fragmented, competences distributed geographically and functionally across nations and across private, public, charitable sector divides. And so if that's the case, what is the mechanism by which they're coordinated in order to be functionally coherent and effective? And if there are large gaps in coverage or in coordination, what choices are available to us to plug those gaps? I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, John. And we go straight to our next speaker. Chantalle Byron is, as I said, no, I haven't said it yet, has an LLM from Cambridge and is a doctoral researcher. Prior to Cambridge, she did her legal studies at Essex, and she also has a Bachelor of Science from a Canadian university. Her research focuses on creating governance architecture for issues in environmental security. So Chantalle is superbly placed to talk to us about the sustainable development aspects of the crisis. Chantalle.
Thank you, Dr. Gehring. The COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns have served as a clear example of not only our interconnectedness with each other as citizens, states, and members of a global community, but it's also demonstrated multiple interlinkages between sustainable development goals. So for those who are unfamiliar with the significance of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, I can provide a very brief introduction. There are 17 SDGs, each with specific targets and measurable indicators. The SDGs include ending poverty in all its forms, achieving food security, achieving gender equality, taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, promoting sustainable economic growth and decent work for all, and with particular relevance to the current pandemic, ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all. The SDGs provide a common framework that facilitates cooperation and action, offering a concise set of public policy priorities with time-bound targets that developing and developed countries alike can pursue according to their national circumstances. So although the SDGs are not binding treaty obligations or customary international law, states are nevertheless required to consider them as a commitment made by the international community in good faith, and they should be considered as providing the normative context for treaty implementation. So SDGs and their targets are entrenched in numerous treaties, from the Paris Agreement on climate change to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women and the Statute of the International Renewable Energy Agency. So as a pandemic, there's an obvious connection between COVID-19 and SDG 3 on health and well-being. However, the wide-ranging economic impacts alone have demonstrated the extent to which the pandemic has impacted us and exacerbated existing inequalities, and they threaten to undermine decades of progress towards the achievement of sustainable and equitable societies. So as we work to rebuild and recover from the pandemic, we have a unique opportunity to reassess past practices and pursue meaningful policies and laws that achieve international legal obligations, advance action to address crucial sustainable development priorities, and rebuild carbon neutral and carbon negative industries and economies. So in the first 2 months alone, governments around the world announced stimulus packages totaling about 10 trillion US dollars, with the UK alone allotting upwards of 132 billion pounds. We can identify some good practices that demonstrate the innovative legal and policy measures taken to ensure that these packages are targeted to help countries, and particularly their most vulnerable communities, to achieve the SDGs. For example, under SDG 1, which aims to end poverty in all its forms, Chile has attempted to protect its citizens from the economic impacts of COVID-19 with a $2 billion US in fiscal measures to support the most vulnerable and independent workers and to enhance subsidies and unemployment benefits, while the Philippines have focused on cash transfers and social protection measures, particularly for the most vulnerable workers, and their stimulus package was around 3.2 billion pounds. So for SDG 2 on zero hunger, Gambia has adopted a measure to reduce the acute national food insecurity that's been caused by the pandemic. And they will fund a 15.8 million US dollar national food distribution program that aims to reach 84% of national households. And with regard to SDG 3 on health, Liberia, who of course experienced the detrimental effects of a contagious disease from the Ebola epidemic, have dedicated to substantially increasing financing in the health sector, as well as promoting the recruitment, training, and retention of healthcare workers and developing rapid response teams. So in line with SDG 8 on decent work and SDG 9 on industry, innovation, and infrastructure, Singapore has invested 20 billion Singapore dollars into research and innovation in very important areas, such as health and biomedicine, artificial intelligence, and combating climate change. Bangladesh has attempted to stabilize the impact of the pandemic on employment by allocating 50 billion Bangladeshi taka to prioritize the creation of industry loans to ensure that workers can still receive a salary. And so far, close to 4 million workers have benefited from these loans. And finally, under SDG 13, to take urgent action to combat climate change, South Korea's New Deal aims to decarbonize its economy, reduce climate change, and bolster green economic activity through a stimulus package of 6.3 trillion South Korean won this year, 67.7 trillion by 2022, and 150 trillion by 2025. So while these policies are undoubtedly a strong effort that foster the SDGs, they will be most effective where they consider and account for the specific needs, vulnerabilities, and challenges of particular communities, such as women, children, Indigenous people, and people with differing abilities. So the impact that Indigenous communities have had on the pursuit of sustainable societies and the conservation of nature are too significant and too numerous to do true justice to in this very short time, but it is essential that policies adopted promote coordination and consultation with regional Indigenous authorities. They reduce and eliminate adversarial processes that remain in Indigenous homelands, such as land grabs, and favor co-management schemes and joint governance programs. with regards to women's rights, it's essential that access to education and employment opportunities for girls and women are included in these policies, and detrimental processes such as mass layoffs in industries that disproportionately affect women are avoided. Children should, of course, have improved quality of education and sustainable development policies, particularly as they relate to climate change. They should be right-based. And finally, those with differing abilities should be recognized as agents and beneficiaries of inclusive, sustainable development. They should have increased access to health facilities, housing, education, and counseling, and should be protected from discriminatory practices and beliefs. Evidently, such an integration of SDGs and human rights approaches in policy and planning will be beneficial at all levels and will be grounded in international treaty commitments. I hope that this very shallow dive into SDGs demonstrates the real danger that we face if we choose to stick to the status quo and maintain our current development practices that are not only inadequate to challenge ever worsening societal inequalities, but also have driven our planet towards critical climactic tipping points. They've caused sharp divisions in our social and economic systems, and they've eroded public trust in key actors such as government, scientists, the media, and healthcare systems. We now have the opportunity not just to build back better, but to build forward and to make meaningful strides towards the achievement of all 17 SDGs. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chantalle. We need to move straight to our next speaker. Dr. Lars Vinx is, of course, our very own Hughes Hall political philosopher. He is also a member of the law faculty and the deputy director of the LLM course. He works on constitutional theory and is best placed to assess the impact of COVID on democracy, the rule of law, and constitutionalism at large. Lars, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. So I'm just going to say, or present a few ideas or thoughts about the potential impact of the COVID-19 crisis on liberal democracy. And to start off, I would like to emphasize, of course, that as we are all aware, there is a crisis of liberal democracy, and liberal democracy's crisis began long before the COVID-19 virus appeared on the scene. So political scientists who are doing comparative research into the development of democracy have found in recent years that democratic countries are backsliding in many cases into forms of authoritarianism, and the number of fully democratic countries in the world has been shrinking for quite some time now. And so the question, of course, that we might be worried about is whether this process of democratic backsliding, as political scientists call it, whether it's going to be intensified or sped up by the COVID-19 crisis. And of course, there are a number of reasons to think that this might be an impact or an effect of the COVID-19 crisis. So for instance, you might be worried that the COVID-19 crisis will interfere with elections or will make it difficult for countries to hold elections as they normally do. Though perhaps the US election this week worked out much better than perhaps one might have expected. Another challenge that John mentioned is, of course, that the COVID-19 crisis has led to a debate about the role of scientific expertise in democratic politics. And of course, in order to respond efficiently to the COVID crisis, politicians have to take account of scientific expertise and act on the basis of scientific information. But we have also seen, of course, that politicians may use talk about the science, as it is called, as a way to shift responsibility for political judgments that, of course, in a democracy they have to take, that they can't offload onto scientists. You might fear as well, of course, that COVID might give a further boost to tendencies towards populism or nationalism that have plagued European democracies in particular. And of course, the crisis of disinformation that we see developing on the social networks has been intensified by a lot of false information about the virus and its impact on human beings. Now, the most important challenge, of course, of all of these is the final challenge, which is that any state, whether it's democratic or not, will have to try to find efficient, effective solutions to the COVID crisis to get the public health problem under control. And of course, polities, whether they are democratic or not, are going to be evaluated in terms of whether they are successful in this challenge or in this task. And one hypothesis or one worry perhaps from a democratic point of view that one might have is that authoritarian states that find it easier to limit citizens' rights or to take drastic measures may have a leg up in responding to the crisis. So perhaps you might expect them to be more successful in dealing with the public health crisis. And if that turns out to be the case, of course, it may lead to a delegitimation of democracy as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, of course, whether this will indeed happen to be the case or not is too early to say. So we are still in the midst of the crisis and we don't yet know how things will play out. But there's a group of comparative political scientists at the University of Göteborg in Sweden who have begun to compare a large number of different countries to collect data on how democratic norms have been compromised or not been compromised in these countries. It's called the VDEM Pandemic Backsliding Project. And they have developed a ranking of countries where countries are ranked in terms of how drastically they restricted democratic norms in the COVID crisis. And so one result, I guess, that's interesting looking at the data they have presented is that there doesn't really seem to be any clear correlation between success in responding to the crisis and the degree to which democratic norms have been compromised. So there are some countries in this data set, some democracies that have been very, very successful in getting on top of COVID-19 without having compromised democratic norms in any significant way. And on the other hand, there are some autocratic states, of course, that have done pretty badly in controlling the COVID crisis, though in those countries, democratic norms may have been quite severely compromised in some cases. Now, of course, there are also successful authoritarian polities and unsuccessful democratic ones. So it's just too early to say, perhaps, at this point, how this story will play out and whether democracy will, in the long run, turn out to be more capable to deal with an emergency like the COVID crisis, or whether this challenge will be better met by authoritarian systems. But at least so far, I guess there's reason to be hopeful. It doesn't seem that the data that's been gathered so far gives rise to a negative assessment of the prospects of democracy. So there is hope, at least, that the crisis of democracy will not necessarily be intensified by COVID. But whether that's the case or not, the future will show. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lars. And we go straight to our last two speakers. Dr. Fotis Vergis is our very own LLM and PhD researcher, alumnus, who has been teaching and researching at the University of Manchester Law School for the last 5 years. Prior to that, he was teaching at the University of Cambridge Faculty of Law as a teaching associate and at the University of Thessaloniki in labor law. He sits on the editorial board for the Labor Law Review in Greece and has been very active in the Hughes Hall community, supervising many of our students. Welcome, a welcome return for you, Fotis, to talk about the human rights impact. And he will be joined in the breakout room by Dr. Martin Steinfeld. Dr. Steinfeld is, of course, our very own Hughes Hall Director of Studies. He is a lecturer at the law faculty in EU law and is a very successful international and EU and public law expert, having researched and focused on citizen rights in particular. And we are going to rely on his expertise to tell us how civil rights and citizens' rights are affected in the pandemic, through the pandemic. Okay, Fotis.
So thank you, Markus, and thank you, Nabil. It's good to be back even in Zoom, in spirit. So we will be discussing civil rights and human rights, and obviously we're talking about civil rights and human rights in the liberal tradition, not in the global South sense, not the Marxist conception of rights. And in doing so, I will be stepping on Lars's toes, I think. So because you cannot talk about the protection of civil and human rights and fundamental rights during a pandemic, during a crisis, without making the connection to democratic processes. So ascribing to the rule of law, the democratic process is one thing. What comes out of that is quite another. And the process that you actually try to engage in is quite another. So there are two things that have been coming out of both civil rights literature, if you will, and the research that has been done over the course of the pandemic. One has to do with the notion of a crisis and using the emergency, the crisis, to introduce amendments to long-standing established frameworks, constitutional frameworks, human rights frameworks. It's not a coincidence that the Council of Europe, nearly 20 days into the lockdown, actually published a report that was providing guidance as to the derogations that were possible from the Council of Europe instruments, namely the European Convention of Human Rights. It shows that they were very much aware that this was a time that would probably be abused by governments to circumvent international human rights obligations. That we have also had similar concerns being raised internally, domestically. So most notably, Lord Sumption, as you probably all know, has been, ringing the bell of autocracy, saying that, claiming that the Public Health Act grants no powers to the government to introduce, countrywide lockdowns, and effectively doing so would amount to introducing autocratic practices in the UK. Now, I wouldn't go as far as agreeing with Lord Sumption, but I think that he makes a point there. There is a danger of government by decree using any sort of emergency as a crisis. So it's basically what Carl Schmitt used to say, that using the crisis as a pretext for introducing autocratic rule, what Mirovsky has described as crisis being but a chance for intervention if you're a neoliberal capitalist economy. And we have seen indications of that happening across the globe. So a notable example has been Italy, where the Decreto Rilancio, which was effectively the governmental statute that introduced financial support measures, but at the same time, restrictions on fundamental civil and political rights in Italy, was passed in a single statute ranging 462 pages in a single article on a day, with a single day of deliberation. So that is one. The second is the substance of these multiple financial emergency measures that came into play over the course of the pandemic. And what they have revealed is what human rights experts tend to overlook sometimes, and that is the connection between traditional civil and political rights on the one hand, social and economic rights on the other. So it's impossible to exercise your economic freedom if you have no means of sustenance. It's impossible to exercise your freedom of movement if the only movement you're able to do is to go out and work, but not necessarily to educate yourself, protest against the abuse of power by the employer, protest against abuse of power by the government. Now, importantly, the Equality and Human Rights Commission here in the UK presented a report about the possible risks to civil and political rights in the UK. And instead of mentioning civil and political rights, they started by referring to rights at work, and most notably those that relate to non-discrimination. Why is that? Precisely because the pandemic revealed not only hidden forms of work, but it also shed a spotlight on types of work that induce social reproduction, if you will. So care home work, garbage collection, essential workers that effectively ended up being those who are more greatly affected than everybody else by the lockdown and the measures. And they were found to be very largely consisting of BAME members, so women, people of color, immigrants, migrant workers, that it is those people who were effectively compelled to return to work while everybody else was home, Netflix and chilling. So there are various forms of research being done right now, predominantly by labor lawyers, interestingly, on not just labor law issues, but rather issues of civil protection, civil rights, social and economic rights. And I have an example here, if I may. In Canada, it was revealed that 56 in the 5 C professions, that is caring, cleaning, cashiering, catering, and clerical, are feminized. So 60% of the overall workers who disinfect hospitals are women. 90% of nurses and 90% of personal support workers are women. So that reveals the potential not only for social reproduction, but also for discriminative practices against already vulnerable groups. Now, how can we react to that? Now, as a colleague of mine said in Belgium recently, pretty much as any virus mutates as we react to it, capitalism tends to mutate as we react to it as well. So once we try to resolve one of the issues, another issue emerges. When we try to resolve issues of populism even that might emerge, fascism emerges someplace else. So what is the actual reaction? I think that the actual reaction might actually be extra legal. So a good example of what happened were the civil rights protests of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US that went completely circumventing any sort of formal processes, circumventing any formal restrictions to free movement, circumventing even prohibitions of movement in certain states, ending up with protests in 2,000 different cities that have eventually led perhaps to political change, but more importantly, perhaps to legal and institutional change. Because alongside those protests, we have legal claims in the tube right now that relate to those discriminated against more vulnerable communities. So effectively, you have a reinvigoration, if you will, of civil rights jurisprudence that emerges not from social procedures, from legal procedures, but rather from social procedures and social movement participation within the context of lockdown. So within the context of legal prohibition. So in my 5 minutes sort of intervention, I wanted to highlight these 2 aspects. So A, the crisis be used as a pretext for restriction of civil and political rights. At the same time, the crisis revealing hidden forms of hidden forms of work and hidden situations, circumstances of vulnerable individuals for whom the protection of civil and political rights were unheard of even because they lacked the status of a citizen, the status of an effective claimant. And also the hopeful note that even in the absence of legal procedures, in the absence of efficient status, and under conditions of lockdown and prohibition, social participation, social engagement leads not to social reproduction itself, but rather the amendment or at least the reconsideration of legal institutions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Fotis. Martin, did you want to come in before we go into the breakout room?
Yes, please.
But really just for 1 minute, okay? Because we need to sort of move on.
Oh, sorry. I think there was a misunderstanding here. I thought I was supposed to be presenting a paper like everybody else, Dr. Gehring, but I'll keep it short and sweet. My perspective, for what it's worth, is partly focused from the perspective of a public lawyer, and partly based, of course, on this government by decree lecture by Lord Sumption that, of course, got traction in the news. Public lawyers predicted this quite considerably, that sweeping restrictions on individual movement was being done in the name of a disease, potentially with a corrosive effect much beyond that. The particular issue for me, for what it's worth, and trying to be as quick as I can, is the issue of the legal validity sorry, I've just noticed John's added a comment, the legal validity of what exactly we were being told back from the 23rd to the 26th of March. This government by decree is leading to, from one perspective, to a lack of legal certainty, which itself is considered to be intrinsic to fundamental rights. The second point I would like to emphasize to everybody is the impact that this lack of legal certainty has had on individuals. So Lord Sumption, thank you, Fotis, much appreciated. Lord Sumption referred to dentists. As it happens, my brother-in-law is a dentist. This isn't just some abstract concept for everybody, but in particular, I was tasked with asking him, well, he can't work. What is the legal basis upon which he's been told he can't work and could potentially be made bankrupt? So from my perspective, the complete lack of legal certainty, not just in terms of what the impact that it had on his life, but in particular, in relation to whether what he could do or not do was legally enforceable or not, is really, really poor lack of constitutionalism that is being done in the interests of a public emergency. And the final thing, focusing on Dr. Gehring's 1 minute approach for me, is in relation to perhaps a critique of Sumption himself. So perhaps it's worth pointing out that unlike Fotis, who quite eloquently pointed out the overall impact on human rights, Lord Sumption himself focuses quite specifically on civil liberties as opposed to human rights, which itself, seen through the strictures of the European Convention, is somewhat problematic. It's interesting that if you read his lecture, there's not actually one mention of human rights as such. And it might be worth perhaps thinking a little bit more about how these restrictions actually fit within the European Convention regime, rather than abstract statements about how it fits in or doesn't fit in within the framework of civil liberties. He starts off from a very basic presumption that the law cannot ordinarily intervene in restricting the movement of healthy people. There isn't per se anything said about that. It's a presumption by Sumption himself. So I just wanted to take a slightly critical approach to that. So there you go. That was about as quick as I could make it, Markus.
Excellent, Martin. That was brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. So what we're going to do now is we're going to randomly assign participants into breakout rooms for about 20 minutes. So if you're not wanting to discuss the issue of the breakout rooms, then please go back into the main room where our wonderful Hughes Hall team, Alison and Amra, are going to then allow you to go into the breakout room that you wish to attend. So I hope everyone is going to participate actively. We're then coming back together at about 10, 12 past the hour, and having a sort of discussion about the topics that were raised in the breakout rooms. Okay? Thank you very much. And we're going to join the breakout rooms now. Yeah, we're slowly coming back from the breakout rooms. And I hope everybody had a successful discussion. We can maybe go back in the order of speakers to briefly summarize. I know the full breadth of the discussions that were had in the breakout rooms is not possible to replicate, but if we have a brief summary from the different breakout sessions, and then we will close this meeting in 15 minutes. But I'm not sure. Alison, is there still a breakout room going?
Not that I can see. I think we've just lost some people.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. John, Where's John? John.
I'm right here, except that I'm not here because my video somehow disappeared when we went into the breakout room and hasn't come back.
Oh
So
dear, John.
as long as you can hear me, that's sufficient.
Yeah, John, tell us about, in a few sentences, about your discussion.
We'll keep it brief. Well, we talked a little bit about that quote from Mahler and the fact that there was in the kind of 70s, a divergence on the international institutional plane between the World Bank, which was introducing structural adjustment and jumping into the health space as well, and the WHO, which was pushing for health for all and primary health care, but the structural adjustment was undermining that because it was cutting budgets way back, left, right, and center, and health suffered. So you had World Bank pulling in one direction and the WHO pulling in the other with considerably less traction, probably as well. We talked a little bit also about the decision-making and the fact that you've got people with power, with less knowledge and positions of authority versus people with scientific knowledge who may have a lesser voice, and the problems of how do you get the interface working constructively between the two. We talked about gain of function research, and it was pointed out that not all gain of function research is dangerous. So that we're talking about a subset when the ethical questions come up, and there are sort of more innocent versions of that. And we, just looking here, was there anything else? Oh, just it's something that we didn't really get into that I wanted to, which was the level of international monitoring and inspection for high risk activities, which is almost negligible. So we can leave it at that.
Sounds great. Chantalle, do you want to come in or do you want me to summarize our joint discussion?
I don't mind starting, but if I miss anything, of course, we'll join in. So I guess we've begun by questioning whether governments were actually taking the opportunity to build back better. And we made a lot of comparisons to the recession in 2008, specifically the way South Korea approached it, which was to invest heavily in sustainable industries. And I mentioned what they're doing now is investing trillions into fighting climate change, into sustainable development goals, and using them kind of as a model because they haven't suffered economically. They have a good standard and quality of living. So I think they're a good example that we can actually use this money to do that. We were also joined by Celine, who's from Malaysia, and so we could get a perspective from that part of the world. And she did express some frustration with perhaps the government's taking, being a bit opportunistic to pursue their own interests and not focusing on some very pressing issues of not only tackling this pandemic, but building back better. We also had a contribution from Daniela, who could provide us with the perspective of the developing world who may not have the ability to invest so heavily into building a green economy, into carbon neutral and negative industries, because they have so many other considerations. And she's noticed a regression in progress that has been made. So, you know, when a developing country has to decide between feeding its citizens or investing in an industry, they're obviously going to choose the former. So it's good to have that perspective too. We also discussed, you know, the overwhelmingly beneficial case that can be made of implementing social protection measures, both in an economic sense and whether or not we really should be assessing the benefits that they have on society in purely economic terms. We also discussed seeing more of a shift to include non-state actors into treaty regimes or intergovernmental organizations that deal with sustainable development goals. So a shift to include more non-state actors, particularly corporations, who play a huge role in not only their huge economic powers, but also they are the cause of many issues that we see, from environmental degradation all the way to improper labor practices. And finally, we talked about a need for greater collaboration amongst states themselves, in partnerships of willing and like-minded states, and how that can be a very good force to inspire action on pursuing the SDGs. And hopefully I've covered everything, if not.
Yeah, you did, absolutely, right? And yeah, so let's move on straight to democracy. Dr. Vinx, Lars.
Okay, yes, so we had quite a lively discussion, I guess, and it turned out that I think most of the participants, they weren't quite as optimistic as I am about the prospects of democracy, and also about things that go on in the UK, perhaps, in terms of the COVID response. And so I guess there were several contributions that pointed out, for instance, that it seems the measures are to some extent unprincipled in terms of what kinds of liberties are restricted and what kinds of liberties are not restricted. That there's a danger, perhaps, that some restrictions of freedom of movement might be abused by the government for purposes other than to control the health crisis. It's been pointed out that there's been a lot of corruption, of course, perhaps in how the UK government has operated in response to the COVID crisis, which is, of course, one of the characteristics otherwise of authoritarian governments. And there was some sympathy, perhaps more sympathy than I have, for the sort of Lord Sumption point of view, that restrictions of liberty have gone too far. And I suppose another issue that we discussed was the question of the role of expertise in a democratic state, and to what extent politicians in a democratic state should follow experts. And of course, part of the motivation of that was the observation that the main reason, apparently, that some countries like the UK have not done so well in responding to the COVID crisis was that they were not well prepared, which in turn may be a result of the fact that the government has not taken the views of scientists seriously enough. Okay, so that was a roundup of the issues, I guess, that we took.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lars. I hope you also had a lively discussion on human rights. Who's Fotis?
So we commiserated in that group, but I think it's only fair to yield the floor to Martin, because he deserves far more than his single minute. And plus, the discussion we had piggybacked on his points with regards to the domestic landscape on civil liberties. So, Martin?
Well, I mean,
does the UK have a constitution, Dr. Stein?
Yeah, we brought that one up. As it happened, Marcus, that became an issue.
Yes.
I'm conscious of the fact that some of my constitutional law students are present in this, and this is just a rerun of the exact discussion that I had in Supervision 1. But with the worrying trend that, in a sense, is corrosive to rights protection, let alone democracy, at least from my point of view, is the lack of legitimacy when it comes to, I mean, we had quite a varied and interesting discussion, but I mean, one thing I thought was quite interesting in terms of pointing it out is the issue of police powers and lack of criminalizing matters with dubious legal authority. And I think the other point that I brought up, which is slightly awkward, as I've said then, from the perspective of being deemed discipline for the college, is the extension into the private sphere of such restrictions. Of course, Fotis is at Manchester, where they famously had this issue of locking students into student halls. And Adam Wagner, barrister, famously commented on this, that this is a sort of 21st century habeas corpus. So the idea that that this has become, the restrictions on liberty have become extensive, not just vertically, but horizontally as well. When did private individuals get the ability to restrict the movement of other private individuals? Fotis,
Wow.
No, definitely. But I mean, it was interesting to hear some perspectives outside of the UK, right? So we had some discussions that tapped onto regimes that were, well, let's say less liberal to a certain extent, but I didn't see the difference really, right? So it seems that effectively we have a common thread connecting everybody right now across the globe. So with autocratic tendencies. So Lord Sampson does have a point in the end of the day. So it is a slippery slope when you start restricting freedoms and human rights on the face of a pandemic, but where does that end and with whom? So as Martin pointed out, we have locked down students in Manchester, and Martin, my supervisions in Hughes were interesting. You know, my first supervision being Greek was interesting, discussing, you know, the UK constitution, the existence thereof. But you should see small group classes and discussions now in Manchester with students locked in for like a month. It's all about civil rights and essentially who gets to abuse any sort of criminal powers, effectively, criminal law powers. Because here we have effectively a criminal sanction being enforced, not by the police, but by a private entity, by a university and the security officers of that university. So that's what I wanted to add. So Martin's point was absolutely crucial in this idea of privatizing criminal law, if you will. But also it was interesting to note the common thread with non-UK jurisdictions that are deemed perceived as not as liberal or as democratic, whereas it seems that we're all in this together.
Yeah, it is. We are where we are. I learned in law school that a criminal law adopted 15 minutes before it's enacted is void because it's not legitimate. But that's in effect what the UK government did a month ago. So yeah, we are at a crucial point, and it reminds me of what Lord Bingham said, right? Those of you and people in the audience who are of the legal profession, you also have a professional obligation towards the rule of law and to upholding rights, especially rights of those who are most vulnerable. And I sometimes sense that we're in the process in this global pandemic of forgetting that is actually a legal duty. We have unfortunately exhausted our time. Professor Farah, do you want to sort of have a final roundup of our I wonder how a scientist sees the sort of legal discussions that we've had this evening. Nabil, you're muted. We still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
yeah.
Perfect.
I don't think I've got anything else to add, but clearly it's very important to get the right interaction. I mean, that's a theme that's come out from this, I think, to get the right interaction between expertise and our political leadership, and to frame these, I think, appropriately in the interests of the population and not just in the interests of particular restricted circles. And that's what I fear has happened, particularly in our country. I don't think I've got anything else that I'd want to add.
Well, thank you very much, Nabil. I think this unfortunately concludes our discussion. I know we have the next couple of seminars in this COVID response series planned. Stephen, do you want to tell us what the next steps are? Because I think what, if anything, what this discussion has shown, that not just different legal fields and different legal expertise needs to come together, we also need to start research across disciplines interaction between lawyers and scientists in a much more active fashion to address this crisis.
Perhaps I could just add, the last in this series is going to be on the 26th of November, and it's really going to focus on the impact of this pandemic on education in a very broad sense. So our educational colleagues will be leading that. Now, what we plan, and this is the reason why we've recorded these sessions, is to have perhaps one or two round table meetings in the Lent term, where we do precisely what you've just said, Markus, and that is to try and bring together different areas of expertise and see where the cross-cutting themes lie in terms of trying to understand how we might change things going forward. So we will certainly be continuing this series, but in a way of trying to integrate what the sorts of issues that we've been discussing in these 4 sessions.
Excellent.
Okay.
Good.
So I think, yeah, carry on, Markus.
No, just to thank everybody, thank Stephen, thank Alison and Aladra for their fabulous preparation for this event, to every presenter, especially my fellow law fellows, Lars and Martin, for their active participation, and of course our 2 brilliant external presenters, Chantalle and Fotis. Please don't be shy to come into Hughes Hall. You're always welcome with us. And yeah, I personally look forward to the next presentation. I should highlight that the real expert on this, Dr. Jeff Skopek, who specializes in medical law, is going to animate the sort of follow-up, because a lot of his research on vaccinations, on ethical medical law issues, actually touches on the more technical details of this pandemic, and that's going to be the next step in our legal discussions. I'm not sure, Stephen, did you want to say anything as Bridge?
I doubt it very much, Mark. It's very kind of you to give me the opportunity, but given we're over time, I just encourage people to keep in touch with us. If they have further thoughts, to speak to the speakers, to get in touch with us, join other events, and basically keep these conversations going. And as Nabil said, we're pulling stuff together probably next term, and that really will be a very interdisciplinary effort. And
yes,
that's what we're all about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Don't fall into the trap to think that if Joe Biden becomes president, all these problems are going to go away.
Just
the opposite might be true. Focus, help us with the Bridge project and get in touch with us all. That's a great advice. And thanks again to all the participants, to you who had these active discussions. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Markus.
Okay.
Thank you, Markus.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.